March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea, north of Papua New Guinea. Dawn breaks over waters crowded with Japanese transport ships, their decks packed with soldiers and supplies desperately needed in Leh. 16 vessels steam in tight formation, protected by 8 destroyers whose lookouts scan the horizon nervously. They have reason to worry. Intelligence reports suggest American aircraft are prowling these waters, but the convoy commander believes his anti-aircraft guns and fighter escorts will be enough. He's about to learn how wrong he can be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound comes first, a deep, throaty roar that builds from a whisper to a thunder. Then they appear, skimming so low over the waves that spray kicks up from their propellers. Modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, their noses bristling with machine guns like flying porcupines. They come in fast, impossibly fast, at masthead height where the ship's guns cannot depress low enough to track them. What happens next unfolds in less than 60 seconds, but those 60 seconds will rewrite the rules of naval warfare in the Pacific. The lead Mitchell opens fire at 400 yards. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously, their combined rate of fire pouring more than 6,000 rounds per minute into the side of a transport ship. Tracers walk up the hull, across the deck, through the superstructure. Metal shreds, wood splinters, men fall. Before the Japanese gunners can react, the bomber is overhead, banking hard, making way for the next aircraft in line. One after another, the Mitchells tear through the convoy like chainsaws through timber. By the time the sun fully rises, the Bismarck Sea will be a graveyard. Of 16 transports and 8 destroyers, only 4 destroyers will escape. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers will drown in the oily water, never having fired a shot in anger. The survivors will speak in hushed tones about the terror of facing those gun-nosed monsters, about watching their ships disintegrate under streams of fire so dense it seemed like a solid wall of metal. This is the story of how the B-25 Mitchell went from a respectable medium bomber to the most feared ship killer in the Pacific. It is a story of tactical innovation born from frustration, of mechanics and pilots who refused to accept that things had to be done the way they always had been. More than that, it is about the men who flew these modified machines into withering fire, who skimmed waves at speeds that left no room for error, and those who faced them from the decks of ships that had nowhere to run. The summer of 1942 found the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific facing a problem that seemed to have no good solution. Japanese convoys were streaming south through the island chains, carrying troops and supplies to reinforce garrisons that threatened Australia itself. Port Moresby on New Guinea's southern coast was the prize, and if it fell, the entire strategic picture would shift in Japan's favor. The Japanese supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean, threading through channels and straits where navigation was treacherous even without enemy action. American and Australian forces knew where these convoys were going. Coast watchers hidden on islands throughout the Solomons and Bismarck archipelago reported ship movements with impressive accuracy. Intelligence officers could often predict convoy routes days in advance. But knowing where the enemy was and being able to do something about it were 2 entirely different problems. The weapons available to interdict these convoys were inadequate for the task at hand. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress could reach the convoys, but hitting a moving ship from 20,000 feet was an exercise in futility. Bombardiers would line up their sights, release their payload, and watch as the bombs fell away. The ships, meanwhile, would simply turn. By the time the bombs reached the altitude where the ships had been, the vessels were somewhere else entirely. Direct hits were rare enough to be noteworthy. Most bombs raised spectacular geysers of water that did nothing but scare fish. Torpedo bombers offered better odds in theory, but the reality was grim. Aircraft like the Douglas TBD Devastator and even its replacement, the TBF Avenger, had to fly slow and straight for their torpedo runs. Japanese ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns, and their crews had become expert at tracking and shooting down the lumbering attackers. The losses among torpedo bomber squadrons were horrific, and even when torpedoes hit, they often failed to detonate or exploded without inflicting critical damage. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and unsustainable. Fighter aircraft could strafe ships, but their light armament was insufficient to sink anything larger than a barge. Destroyers and transports could absorb hundreds of rounds from 30-caliber machine guns and keep steaming. What was needed was something that combined the hitting power of heavy weapons with the accuracy of low-level attack, delivered by an aircraft that could survive the engagement. The existing doctrine offered no clear answer, but doctrine was about to meet innovation in the person of a major who refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. Major Paul Gunn was not a typical officer. An American civilian pilot who had been in the Philippines when the war started, he evacuated his family just before Manila fell, then stayed to fight. The Navy commissioned him and put his considerable flying skills to work, but Gunn was not content to simply follow orders and fly assigned missions. He was a tinkerer, a mechanic, an engineer who saw problems as invitations to experiment. When he looked at the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, he saw not what it was, but what it could become. The B-25 was a solid aircraft, built by North American Aviation and named for General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power. It was a twin-engine bomber with a crew of 5 or 6, designed to carry bombs internally and drop them from medium altitude. It had defensive machine guns in the nose, dorsal turret, waist positions, and tail, but these were exactly that, defensive. The bomber's offensive capability was its bomb load, which it delivered from altitudes measured in thousands of feet. Gunn looked at this conventional arrangement and saw inefficiency. What if, Gunn reasoned, instead of climbing to altitude and hoping to hit moving targets with gravity-dropped bombs, the B-25 could attack at wave-top height with forward-firing weapons? The nose of the bomber was mostly transparent plexiglass, necessary for the bombardier to see his target. But if you removed the bombardier position and filled that nose with machine guns, you would have a flying weapons platform unlike anything in the theater. The concept was radical enough to be dismissed by conventional thinkers, but Gunn had allies who understood that desperate times called for creative solutions. Major General George Kenney commanded the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, and he was exactly the kind of leader who appreciated innovation. When Gunn approached him with the idea of converting B-25s into strafers, Kenney immediately grasped the potential. He authorized experiments, and Gunn went to work with a small team of mechanics and armorers who shared his vision. They began with a single B-25 that had been too damaged to fly conventional missions, turning it into a test bed for ideas that would have seemed insane to orthodox planners. The first modifications were straightforward. They removed the bombardier position and the transparent nose entirely, replacing it with a solid metal structure. Into this new nose, they mounted 4 50-caliber machine guns fixed to fire forward. The guns were synchronized so the pilot could fire them all with a single trigger. Initial test flights were promising, but Gunn knew that 4 guns, while impressive, were not enough. He wanted overwhelming firepower, the kind that would shred a target in a single pass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Kept modifying. The final configuration that emerged from these experiments was almost absurd in its concentration of firepower. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in the nose, 4 on each side, all firing forward. Each gun had a rate of fire of approximately 800 rounds per minute, which meant the combined battery could deliver over 6,000 rounds per minute. At typical engagement ranges of 300 to 500 yards, this stream of fire was devastating. But the modifications did not stop there. Additional guns were added to the sides of the fuselage, mounted in packages that could fire forward and slightly to either side. Some aircraft eventually carried 12 or even 14 50-caliber machine guns, all aimed forward, all under the pilot's control. The weight of this armament was substantial, and it affected the bomber's performance characteristics. The modified B-25s were nose-heavy and required careful trimming to fly properly. They were slower than standard bombers and less maneuverable, but what they lacked in grace, they made up for in sheer destructive power. The ammunition for these guns was carefully selected. Armorers loaded a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The armor-piercing rounds could punch through ship hulls and deck plating. The incendiary rounds started fires when they hit fuel, cargo, or wooden structures. The tracers allowed pilots to see where their fire was going and adjust their aim in real time. When all 8 nose guns fired together, the tracer pattern looked like a solid stream of light reaching out from the bomber to the target. Training pilots to use these modified bombers required developing entirely new tactics. Conventional bombing technique was irrelevant. These pilots were not bombardiers releasing weapons from altitude, but gunfighters who would close to point-blank range and hose their targets with machine gun fire. The attack profile they developed was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Approach the target at extremely low altitude, often less than 50 feet above the water. This kept the aircraft below the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns and made them difficult to track and engage. Accelerate to maximum speed on the approach. The faster the bomber was moving, the less time enemy gunners had to aim and fire. Open fire at 400 to 500 yards, which at the bomber's closing speed gave roughly 3 to 4 seconds of firing time before having to pull up and over the target. Pour as many rounds as possible into the target during that brief window, aiming for vulnerable areas like the waterline, bridge, and deck cargo. Then brake hard left or right, staying low, and get away before the target's escorts could react. The risks were enormous. Flying at masthead height left no room for error. A moment's inattention, a sudden gust of wind, a minor mechanical problem, any of these could send the bomber cartwheeling into the water. The ocean at that altitude was not a distant abstraction, but an immediate, deadly presence. Pilots could see individual waves, could feel the bomber buck and shudder in the turbulent air near the surface. If something went wrong, there was no altitude to trade for time, no room to recover. You either flew perfectly or you died. Then there was the return fire. Japanese ships had learned the hard way that American aircraft were a serious threat, and they had increased their anti-aircraft armament accordingly. Transports that might have sailed with only a few machine guns early in the war now bristled with automatic cannons and heavy machine guns. Destroyers and S-ports were floating anti-aircraft batteries. When a low-flying bomber appeared, every gun that could be brought to bear would open fire. The volume of fire could be incredible, creating patterns of tracers that looked like spider webs. Flying through this fire required nerves that most men did not possess. Pilots had to hold their course steady during the approach, even as tracers streaked past their cockpits and shells burst around them. Flinching, even slightly, could throw off their aim and waste the brief firing opportunity. The men who could do this, who could bore in through walls of fire and calmly trigger their guns at the precise moment for maximum effect, were a special breed. They were not necessarily the best pilots in the technical sense, but they had the temperament for this kind of work. The modified B-25s needed a name, and the one that stuck was both descriptive and slightly ominous. They were called strafers, after the German word describing low-level attack. Some crews called them gunships. Others used less official terms that reflected either pride or dark humor about the dangerous work they did. But regardless of the name, the concept was now proven in test flights and small-scale attacks. What remained was to demonstrate the tactic on a large scale, against a target that mattered, in a way that would validate the entire approach. That opportunity came in early 1943, when intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese convoy was preparing to depart Rabaul, the heavily fortified base at the northern tip of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae, on New Guinea's northern coast, where Japanese forces desperately needed reinforcement. The convoy would have to transit the Bismarck Sea, a stretch of water that American aircraft could reach from bases in Papua New Guinea and northern Australia. General Kenny saw this as the perfect chance to unleash his Strafer B-25s against a worthwhile target. The Japanese convoy was substantial, reflecting the importance of its mission. 16 transport ships carried approximately 7,000 troops from the 51st Division, along with supplies, equipment, and ammunition. 8 destroyers provided escort, their crews on high alert for submarine and air attack. The convoy commander was confident that his forces could fight their way through. Previous convoys had suffered losses, but had generally succeeded in delivering enough troops and supplies to justify the risks. This convoy, he believed, would be no different. American intelligence tracked the convoy from the moment it left Rabaul. Coast watchers radioed sighting reports. Long-range reconnaissance flights confirmed the convoy's composition and heading. At Allied Air Headquarters, operations officers planned an attack that would employ every available asset. Heavy bombers would attack from altitude to force the ships to maneuver. Medium bombers would come in at mid-level with skip bombs, a technique where bombs were released so low that they skipped across the water into the sides of ships like stones across a pond. And the Strafer B-25s would make their low-level runs, raking the ships with machine gun fire. March 2nd brought the first attacks. B-17 flying fortresses droned overhead, dropping their bombs from high altitude. The results were as expected. Near misses and spectacular splashes, but few direct hits. The convoy steamed on, its commanders confident that they had weathered the worst. That night, the ships continued south, unaware that the real attack was yet to come. As the sun rose on March 3rd, the convoy was exactly where American planners wanted it, in the open waters of the Bismarck Sea, beyond effective range of land-based Japanese fighters, vulnerable to sustained air attack. The Strafer B-25s came in first, arriving just after dawn when visibility was good, but many of the ship's crews were still at breakfast or changing watch. There were 13 of the modified bombers in the first wave, flying in loose formation at wave-top height. The Japanese lookouts spotted them late, confused by the low altitude and the unorthodox attack profile. By the time the alarm was sounded and gunners rushed to their stations, the Mitchells were already in firing range. The lead pilot selected the largest transport in his sight picture, a vessel so crowded with troops that men were visible on every inch of deck space. He pressed the trigger. 8 50-caliber machine guns roared to life, their muzzle flashes bright even in the morning light. The stream of bullets walked across the water, climbed
The ship's hull and tore across the deck. Men fell in heaps. Metal structures disintegrated. Wooden lifeboats exploded into splinters. The pilot held the trigger down for 4 seconds, then pulled up sharply, banking hard to avoid colliding with the ship's superstructure. Behind him, the second Mitchell was already firing at the same target, then the third, then the fourth. Each bomber poured hundreds of rounds into the transport ship, which was now burning in multiple places and listing heavily. Men were jumping overboard, choosing the sea over the inferno the ship had become. But the strafers were already moving to their next targets, selecting fresh ships from the convoy with clinical efficiency. What had been an orderly formation of vessels was rapidly becoming a scene of chaos. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were firing now, throwing up walls of tracers and explosive shells. But the strafers were difficult targets. They came in fast and low, presenting narrow profiles that were hard to track. By the time a gunner had his sights aligned, the bomber had already fired and was pulling away. The few hits the defenders scored were mostly minor, punching holes in wings or fuselages, but failing to bring down the attackers. The exchange of fire was brutally one-sided, and the Japanese were on the losing end. As the first wave of strafers completed their runs and turned for home to rearm and refuel, the second wave arrived. These bombers carried a different loadout, combining the forward-firing machine guns with bombs designed for skip bombing. The pilots would come in low, fire their guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire, then release their bombs to skip across the water into the ship's hulls below the waterline. The combination of machine gun fire and bombs was devastating. Ships that had survived the first wave were now taking catastrophic damage. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the convoy. Heavy bombers continued their high-altitude runs. Australian bow fighters joined the fight, adding their cannon and machine gun fire to the carnage. The Strafer B-25s made multiple sorties, their crews landing, rearming in record time, and taking off again to rejoin the battle. The Japanese convoy
which had begun the day in tight formation and steaming confidently toward its destination, was now scattered across miles of ocean, burning, sinking, dead in the water. The destroyers tried to fight back and to rescue survivors, but they were overwhelmed. American aircraft attacked them as aggressively as they attacked the transports, recognizing that every escort sunk was one less ship that could threaten future operations. By late afternoon, the sea was covered with debris, lifeboats, and men clinging to wreckage. The water was slicked with oil from ruptured fuel tanks, and in many places the oil was burning, creating patches of flame that drifted with the current. When the final tally was compiled, the numbers told a story of devastation that shocked even those who had planned the attack. Of 16 transports, all 16 were sunk or so heavily damaged they had to be abandoned. Of 8 destroyers, 4 were sunk, and the remaining 4 were damaged. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, along with hundreds of sailors. The 51st Division, which had boarded those transports as a fighting force, effectively ceased to exist before ever reaching the battlefield. It was one of the most one-sided victories of the Pacific War. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it came to be known, validated everything that Major Gunn and General Kenny had believed about the strafer concept. The modified B-25s had performed exactly as hoped, delivering devastating firepower with acceptable losses. Only 4 American aircraft were shot down during the 3 days of attacks, a remarkably low number given the intensity of the combat. The strafers had proven that low-level attack with massed machine guns was not just viable, but devastatingly effective against maritime targets. News of the victory spread quickly through Allied forces in the Pacific. Morale, which had been strained by years of combat, doubts about the alliance's strategy and leadership, and losses and efforts with little to show for them, soared. The strafers had not only delivered a victory, but they had sent out a clear message. The Allies were innovating and using technology to level the playing field. The Japanese were warned. Their ships were no longer safe at sea.
Months of hard fighting and slow progress surged. The Japanese were not invincible. Their convoys could be stopped. Their reinforcements could be prevented from reaching their destinations. The balance of power in the Southwest Pacific had shifted, and everyone knew it. More immediately, the destruction of the convoy meant the Japanese forces at Lae would not receive the reinforcements and supplies they desperately needed, making subsequent Allied operations in New Guinea significantly easier. For the Japanese, the disaster in the Bismarck Sea was a psychological blow as much as a material one. They had believed their convoys, protected by destroyers and operating under air cover, were reasonably safe. The sheer speed and violence of the American attack shattered that assumption. Survivors who were eventually rescued told stories of ships being torn apart by streams of machine gun fire so dense it seemed impossible. They described the terror of watching bombers come in at wave height, their noses flashing with muzzle fire, knowing there was nowhere to hide and no way to fight back effectively. The implications for Japanese strategy were profound. If convoys could no longer safely transit the waters between major bases, then reinforcing and supplying forward garrisons became nearly impossible. Every shipment would require massive escorts and would still face unacceptable risks. The Japanese logistics network, already strained by submarine attacks and the vast distances involved in operating across the Pacific, was now under assault from a new and deadly threat. The strafer B-25s forced Japanese planners to reconsider routes, schedules, and the very feasibility of certain operations. Back at Allied air bases, mechanics and armorers worked around the clock to convert more B-25s to the strafer configuration. The demand for these aircraft was insatiable. Every squadron wanted them. Every commander who had seen what they could do wanted more under his command. The modification process became standardized, with technical orders and procedures developed to ensure consistency across different bases and maintenance units. What had started as an improvised experiment by a handful of innovators became official doctrine. The evolution of the strafer continued throughout 1943 and into 1944.
Engineers refined the gun installations, improving reliability and making the weapons easier to maintain. They experimented with different ammunition mixes, seeking the optimal balance of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. They added more guns in some configurations, pushing the total to 14 or even 16 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in some aircraft. The weight and drag of these installations reduced the bomber's range and ceiling, but for the low-level shipping strike role, these trade-offs were acceptable.
1944. Convoy after convoy was mauled or destroyed. Japanese shipping losses in the Southwest Pacific reached unsustainable levels. Bases that had once been regularly resupplied found themselves on starvation rations. Garrisons withered, unable to receive reinforcements or replacement equipment. The maritime supply lines that were essential to Japanese strategy in the region were cut. Not completely, but severely enough to cripple offensive operations and make defense increasingly difficult. The human cost of these attacks was staggering on both sides. For Japanese soldiers crowded onto transport ships, the attacks were a nightmare. There was no training that prepared you for the experience of being on a wooden deck when 8 50-caliber machine guns opened fire at 400 yards. The rounds punched through everything: hull planking, deck structures, human bodies. The noise was overwhelming, a hammering roar that drowned out screams and shouts. The tracers seemed to fill the air with deadly light. And then, often, came fire, as incendiary rounds ignited fuel or cargo. Survivors described the chaos of ships breaking apart, of men jumping into seas that were themselves burning in places, of swimming through debris fields while aircraft continued to attack nearby vessels. Some spent days clinging to wreckage before being rescued or washing ashore on islands, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. The psychological trauma of these experiences marked men for life. Veterans of convoy attacks often refused to board ships again, preferring any other form of transportation even decades after the war. For the American air crews, the work was dangerous and exhausting. Every mission involved flying at altitudes where a single mistake meant instant death. Every attack run meant boring through walls of anti-aircraft fire, trusting that speed and luck would see you through. The physical and mental strain was immense. Pilots returned from missions soaked with sweat despite the cold at altitude, hands cramping from gripping the controls during violent maneuvers, ears ringing from the sound of their own guns firing for extended periods. Some crews developed superstitions, rituals they believed kept them alive. Lucky scarves, particular prayer routines, insistence on flying only certain aircraft. Others became fatalistic, convinced that death was random and inevitable, that all you could do was your job and hope. The bonds between crew members grew incredibly strong, forged in shared danger and the knowledge that your life depended on the men around you doing their jobs perfectly. When crews were lost, the grief among survivors was profound. Yet despite the dangers and the losses, morale among strafer crews remained high. They knew they were making a difference. They could see the results of their work in dramatic and immediate terms: ships burning, sinking, exploding, convoys scattered and destroyed, the enemy's ability to wage war tangibly reduced with each successful mission. This sense of purpose, of contributing meaningfully to the war effort, sustained men through missions that might otherwise have broken them. They were not just surviving the war, but actively winning it. The technical challenges of maintaining the strafer B-25s were considerable and grew more complex as the modifications became more elaborate. Each aircraft required specialized attention from armorers who understood the intricacies of mounting and synchronizing multiple machine guns. The guns themselves were robust weapons, the Browning M250 caliber machine gun being one of the most reliable automatic weapons ever designed. But reliability did not mean maintenance-free, especially under the harsh conditions of the Southwest Pacific Theater. Humidity was a constant enemy. The tropical climate meant that metal parts corroded rapidly if not properly maintained. Barrels had to be cleaned after every mission and inspected for wear that could affect accuracy or lead to catastrophic failure.
The feed mechanisms that moved ammunition belts into the guns were particularly vulnerable to dirt and corrosion. A single grain of sand in the wrong place could cause a jam, and a jammed gun during an attack run meant reduced firepower at the moment it was most needed. Armorers developed elaborate cleaning and maintenance routines, working through nights to ensure every gun on every aircraft was ready for the next mission. Ammunition supply was another ongoing concern. Each Strafer B-25 consumed thousands of rounds per mission. With multiple aircraft flying multiple sorties, the demand for .50 caliber ammunition was enormous. Supply chains stretched across thousands of miles of ocean had to deliver not just the ammunition, but the right mix of ammunition types. Armor-piercing rounds required different manufacturing processes than incendiary rounds. Tracer rounds needed phosphorus compounds that had to be handled carefully. Coordinating all of this so that crews had what they needed when they needed it required logistical efforts that were invisible to the pilots but absolutely essential to operations. The guns themselves generated tremendous heat when fired. 8 machine guns firing simultaneously for even a few seconds produced enough heat to make the metal components glow. Pilots reported that after extended firing, they could feel the heat radiating back into the cockpit through the bulkhead. This heat affected accuracy as barrels expanded and could even cause ammunition to cook off if rounds were left in hot chambers. Crews learned to fire in controlled bursts when possible, conserving both ammunition and barrel life, though in the heat of combat, such discipline was not always feasible. Weight distribution was another technical issue that engineers had to solve. Adding 8 or more heavy machine guns to the nose of an aircraft fundamentally changed its center of gravity. The B-25 had been designed with specific weight distributions in mind, and throwing that balance off could make the aircraft dangerously unstable. Engineers compensated by removing equipment from other areas and sometimes adding ballast to the tail section. Even with these adjustments, Strafer B-25s handled differently than standard models. Pilots had to learn these characteristics and adjust their flying accordingly. The recoil from firing all guns simultaneously was significant enough to slow the aircraft noticeably. Pilots reported that engaging the guns felt like hitting an invisible wall in the air. The bomber would shudder, its speed would drop, and the nose would want to pitch up from the recoil force. Experienced pilots learned to anticipate this and compensate with control inputs, but it was one more thing to manage during an already demanding attack run. New pilots sometimes found the sensation so disconcerting that their first few firing passes were ineffective simply because they were fighting the aircraft rather than flying it smoothly. Training programs evolved to address these challenges. New Strafer pilots went through intensive preparation that combined traditional flying skills with gunnery training more typically associated with fighter pilots. They practiced low-altitude flying for hours, learning to judge height above water with precision. They flew mock attack runs against target ships in harbors, though without live ammunition. They studied Japanese ship recognition, learning to identify different vessel types at a glance so they could prioritize targets effectively during the chaos of an actual attack. The psychological preparation was equally important. Flying into concentrated anti-aircraft fire required a mental toughness that not all pilots possessed. Training officers tried to simulate the stress through various means, having gunners fire blanks near trainee aircraft during practice runs, using pyrotechnics to create visual distractions, anything to prepare pilots for the sensory overload of actual combat. But everyone knew that no training could fully replicate the experience of having explosive shells burst around your cockpit while you tried to hold a steady course and aim your guns. Some men discovered they simply could not do it. There was no shame in this realization. The human nervous system has limits, and forcing oneself to fly toward danger rather than away from it violated every survival instinct. These pilots were reassigned to other duties where their skills could be useful without requiring them to perform tasks their psychology would not permit. The men who could do it, who could master their fear enough to function in those circumstances, were remarkable not because they felt no fear, but because they acted effectively despite it. Crew dynamics aboard Strafer B-25s were different from those on standard bombers. In a conventional B-25, the crew was spread throughout the aircraft, each member having a specific station and role. The bombardier was in the nose, the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, the navigator at his station, gunners in the dorsal turret and waist positions. On a strafer, the nose position was eliminated, replaced by guns. The navigator often doubled as a gunner. The crew was smaller and more compact, which changed the interpersonal dynamics. The pilot bore extraordinary responsibility. On a conventional bomber, the pilot flew the aircraft, but the bombardier actually released the weapons. On a strafer, the pilot was both driver and gunner. He aimed the aircraft like a weapon, his marksmanship determining whether the mission succeeded or failed. This concentration of responsibility meant that strafer pilots needed not just flying skills, but also combat instinct, the ability to make split-second decisions about targeting, approach angles, and when to break off an attack. Not every skilled pilot had these additional qualities. Co-pilots on strafers had less clearly defined roles than on standard bombers. They managed power settings and systems during attack runs, giving the pilot more bandwidth to focus on flying and gunnery. They served as extra eyes, watching for threats the pilot might miss. In aircraft with side-mounted guns, co-pilots sometimes controlled these additional weapons, adding their firepower to the nose guns. The partnership between pilot and co-pilot had to be seamless. There was no time during an attack run to discuss or debate decisions. Each man had to know what the other would do and trust that it would be done correctly. Rear gunners on strafers faced unique challenges. After the aircraft completed its attack run and pulled up over the target, the rear gunner had a clear view of the ship being left behind. Often, these gunners would engage with their own weapons, raking the ship's superstructure as the bomber climbed away. But they also had to watch for pursuing fighters or fire from escort vessels. The rear gunner was the crew's insurance against threats from behind, and his vigilance could mean the difference between returning to base and being shot down during the withdrawal. The relationship between strafer crews and ground support personnel was unusually close. Armorers, mechanics, and ordnance handlers understood that their work directly affected whether the aircrew lived or died. A poorly maintained gun, an incorrectly loaded ammunition belt, a loose mounting bracket, any of these could be fatal during combat. The ground crews took enormous pride in their work and felt personally invested in the success and survival of the flight crews. When an aircraft returned damaged but flyable, ground crews often worked through the night to repair it so it would be available for the next mission. Losses among strafer crews, while lower than among some other bomber types, were still significant. Anti-aircraft fire occasionally found its mark. Mechanical failures at low altitude could be fatal. Mid-air collisions occurred when multiple aircraft attacked the same target simultaneously. Fighters, when they managed to intercept attack formations, could be devastating. Each loss was mourned not just by fellow aircrew, but by the entire ground support team that had maintained that aircraft and known its crew. The impact of strafer operations extended beyond the immediate destruction of ships and supplies. The psychological effect on Japanese forces throughout the theater was considerable. Soldiers and sailors knew that any ship they boarded might be attacked. This level of pressure and concern for their survival must have taken its toll on morale and efficiency, a kind of low-level, persistent warfare that can translate into serious mishaps.
Knowledge created a pervasive anxiety that affected morale and, more practically, made it difficult to move troops when needed. Units that might have been deployed to reinforce critical positions remained in rear areas because the risk of transport was deemed too high. This paralysis of the Japanese logistics system was in many ways as valuable as the physical destruction of specific convoys. Japanese naval doctrine was forced to adapt in ways that spread resources thin. More destroyers and escort vessels had to be assigned to convoy duty, meaning fewer were available for offensive operations. Fighter aircraft that might have been used to support ground forces or attack Allied positions were instead tied down, providing combat air patrol over convoys. Anti-aircraft guns that could have protected land bases were installed on ships. The Strafer B-25s forced a reallocation of Japanese resources that weakened their overall strategic position even beyond the direct losses inflicted. Intelligence analysts studying Japanese communications noted a distinct shift in tone when Strafer attacks were mentioned. Reports from convoy commanders became increasingly pessimistic. After-action analyses emphasized the difficulty of defending against low-level attacks. Recommendations for avoiding these attacks became more desperate, suggesting increasingly circuitous routes, night sailing only, or even abandoning certain supply runs altogether. The fear was palpable in the intercepted messages, and that fear was itself a weapon. The Strafer concept spread to other theaters and other aircraft types as the war progressed. The success in the Southwest Pacific did not go unnoticed by commanders elsewhere. In the Mediterranean, Allied forces experimented with similar modifications to medium bombers. In the China-Burma-India theater, B-25s were modified for ground attack roles against Japanese positions and supply lines. The fundamental principle that Major Gunn and General Kenny had proven, that overwhelming forward-firing machine gun armament could be devastating in the right circumstances, became part of the broader doctrine of air warfare. Even the Germans, facing their own challenges with Allied shipping and ground forces, developed similar concepts. The Junkers Ju-88, a versatile bomber, was modified into versions that carried heavy forward-firing cannon for use against ships and ground targets. The principle was universal. Concentrated firepower, accurately delivered, could achieve results that dispersed or less focused armament could not. The Strafer B-25 was not the only aircraft to embody this principle, but it was among the most successful and certainly the most feared by Japanese forces in the Pacific. Individual stories from Strafer crews revealed the human dimensions of this technological and tactical innovation. Lieutenant Robert Thorne flew Strafers from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal during the later stages of the campaign. His diary, preserved in archives, provides a window into the daily life of a Strafer pilot. Thorne describes the pre-mission briefings where intelligence officers would show reconnaissance photos of targets and discuss expected defenses. He writes about the tense flight to the target area, scanning the horizon for enemy fighters, descending to wave-top height as the target came into view. His descriptions of the actual attacks are vivid and unsettling. He writes about picking a specific ship from a convoy, lining it up in his sight, and watching his tracers walk toward it across the water. He describes the shockwave of his own bullets impacting the target, visible even through the propeller arc. He recounts pulling up over burning ships, seeing men jumping into the water, feeling both satisfaction at mission success and unease at the human cost. Thorne survived the war, but his diary suggests the psychological weight of what he had done stayed with him. Sergeant Michael Castellano was an armorer who maintained the guns on Strafer B-25s at Port Moresby. His letters home, matter-of-fact in their description of grueling work routines, occasionally reveal moments of deeper reflection. He writes about
working all night to replace a damaged gun mount, knowing that the aircraft would be flying again at dawn. He describes the satisfaction of seeing an aircraft return safely, knowing that his work had contributed to that success. He also writes about the times aircraft did not return and the hollow feeling of working on someone else's plane the next day. Castellano's technical descriptions are illuminating. He explains the process of timing the guns so they all fired synchronously, the importance of proper headspace adjustment to prevent jams, the careful selection of ammunition to ensure the mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds was optimal. His letters read like love notes to the machines and weapons he maintained, a pride of craftsmanship evident in every line. For men like Castellano, the Strafer B-25 was not just a weapon, but a complex mechanism that demanded respect and skill to keep operational. Captain William Hayes served as an intelligence officer supporting Strafer operations from Darwin, Australia. His reports, clinical and detailed, tracked the evolution of tactics over months of operations. Hayes documented hit rates, ammunition expenditure per target destroyed, survival rates of crews using different attack profiles. His work helped identify which tactics were most effective and which were unnecessarily risky.
But buried in his official reports are occasional personal observations that hint at the strain of sending men into danger repeatedly. Hayes writes about the difficulty of maintaining operational security when everyone on the base knew which crews had not returned from missions. He describes the challenge of keeping morale high when losses occurred in clusters, several aircraft lost in a single bad mission. He reflects on the responsibility of planning attacks, knowing that his decisions would directly influence who lived and who died. The weight of that responsibility, carried by planning officers throughout the theater, was immense, even if it was less visible than the danger faced by air crews. The Strafer B-25s continued to evolve throughout 1944 as the war moved closer to the Japanese home islands. Modifications became more sophisticated. Some aircraft received upgraded sights that made aiming more precise. Experiments with different gun positions led to configurations where some weapons could be trained slightly to the sides, allowing the pilot to engage targets that were not directly ahead. Engine upgrades improved performance, compensating somewhat for the weight and drag of the heavy armament. Each improvement made the aircraft more effective and, critically, improved crew survival rates. By late 1944, the nature of targets was changing. Large convoys became rarer as Japanese shipping was increasingly scarce and scattered. Strafer crews found themselves attacking smaller targets, individual transports, coastal shipping, barges. The tactics adapted accordingly. Attacks became more opportunistic, with patrols hunting for targets of opportunity rather than striking at pre-planned convoy routes. The kill rate per mission declined simply because there were fewer large targets available, but the cumulative impact remained significant. The introduction of new Japanese defensive measures kept the fight from becoming one-sided. Increased use of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire made approaches more dangerous. Japanese fighters developed tactics specifically for attacking low-flying strafers, diving on them during their vulnerable attack runs. Some Japanese ships were equipped with heavier armor that could resist .50 caliber fire, requiring more concentrated fire or hits in specific vulnerable areas. The tactical chess game continued, with both sides learning and adapting. One significant development was the increased use of night attacks. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.